All right. Thanks very much for inviting me. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. I decided today to focus really on the impacts of oxygen in the magnetosphere, not talking so much about the source and the transport. And I want to make sure to acknowledge my group, Chris Muikis, and then my former graduate student, Jing Liao, and my current graduate student, Yanhua Liu, who did a lot of the work that I will be presenting here. So we had a lot of introduction this morning on what the source is, so I'll just touch on that briefly. I'll then look at what the composition is and how it varies in the plasma sheet, and then I'll look at a number of impacts. First, what the impact may be on substorm loading and loading, how it affects the current sheet thickness, how it may affect these Sawtooth events, and then I suspect I won't really have time to get to this, but if I do, we'll also talk about the inner magnetosphere. Okay, so as Andrew Yao discussed this morning, there's really two things that affect how much oxygen flows out. One very important one is the solar, which changes on solar cycle timescales as indicated here, but can also change on much shorter time scales. The EUV changes predominantly the scale height of the oxygen, preferentially over the protons, as shown in this nice little schematic. So there's a solar cycle dependence, there's a solar activity dependence, and there's also a seasonal dependence just due to that EUV, the changes in the EUV. And then in addition, we have the more dynamic changes from the solar wind driving. We have both waves pointing flux into the ionosphere and electron precipitation, both of which have the effects of heating the ionosphere, one through Joule dissipation and the precipitation through electron heating and ionization, as sort of summarized in this nice schematic by Strangeway et al. The heating of the ionosphere then increases the ion scale height. That leads to ion upwelling. Then the driving also generates waves, which lead to further acceleration, and we finally get the ion outflow. So this is all the geomagnetic activity, and we standardly use Kp as kind of a broad index that captures that. All the data that I'm showing today comes from the Kistler mission, and just to remind, Kistler is in a polar orbit, and for at least the first 5 years of its mission, the perigee was at 4 RE, apogee is at around 20 RE, so it has nice measurements in the inner magnetosphere, it has nice measurements of the 20 RE plasma sheet, and then also gets good measurement of the transport in the lobes. So I want to concentrate on the plasma sheet. So this is the results of a statistical study using the cluster tail seasons. So this just shows the distribution of the data points in the tail. And this now shows how the composition in the central plasma sheet varies, first as a function of F10.7, and then independently as a function of Kp. So this is all measurements in the central plasma sheet. So with F10.7, there actually is very little change in the proton density, but the oxygen density increases significantly, and so as a result, the oxygen to proton ratio increases just with F10.7, even when it's quiet time. And then you have on top of that this increase with Kp. So each of them can really give you about a factor of 10, and so during active solar maximum times, you really have a significantly more oxygen heavy central plasma sheet. In addition, you can see that there's significant scatter around these average lines. So just knowing F10.7 and Kp is not nearly enough to tell you very definitively what the composition is. So that leads then to a wide range of conditions in the plasma sheet, from oxygen being just a really minor player to occasional time periods where it's even the dominant ion. So the question is, how does this oxygen change the dynamics of the plasma sheet? I first want to discuss just a little bit about why oxygen is different compared to proteins, and everything on this slide is trivial, but it helps to sometimes remember these things. So first of all, it's heavier. The mass is a factor of 16 times higher than the protons. So when you look at it from a fluid perspective, that means it's changing the mass density, and so that can affect the alphane speed. If the reconnection rate goes as the alphane speed, that means it can change the reconnection rate. But note that the oxygen really only has that effect if it's frozen in with the plasma, if it's that fluid that's oscillating. So that's related to the second point, that the gyroradius is 4 times larger than protons at the same energy. So that means the oxygen is much more likely to be demagnetized, or you can say that the diffusion region for oxygen is larger than the diffusion region for protons. And so the oxygen is more likely to be decoupled, and when it's decoupled, it then does not affect the plasma parameters in the same way, and kinetic effects really become critical. And then third, when you're looking at plasma flowing at the same velocity, oxygen has 16 times the energy. And so that has a number of implications. So for example, this morning, Stein Holland talked about those cold populations in the lobe. So the trajectories of the ions that move into the lobe are affected by what's called the velocity filter effect, where they're parallel motions going as the velocity, but they all convect perpendicular together. That results in trajectories that get separated by their velocity. So all ions with the same velocity follow the same trajectory. And so that means if you look at a particular point, the oxygen that's on that trajectory, whoops, why did that happen? Why did it go out? And why does it now have this thing on the side? Okay. Hopefully it stays. So whereas the protons that are observed here are cold and normally below the energies where the particle instruments that can measure them, the oxygen on that same trajectory has this factor of 16 higher in energy, and therefore can be observed. And there have been a lot of observations of these cold oxygen beams in the lobe. And it also means that when those ions enter the plasma sheet, the oxygen that enters at a particular location has 16 times the energy of the protons that are entering at that location. So you're getting a more energetic population coming into the plasma sheet at any particular point. And another thing is that oxygen, clearly that's moving at the bulk flow, it's more energetic, so it tends to look more like energetic particles. So as sort of an example of this shows a magnetopause crossing. So here we're showing the protons on top, and then here's the oxygen, and you see we're going, so here we're in the magnetosphere, then you can see the dense magnetosheath flowing population. If you look at the oxygen, so the population that I have circled here is actually just crosstalk from the very intense protons. We have like a 1% spillover into the oxygen, and 1% turns out to be a lot when you're talking about the magnetosheath. So that's not real oxygen, but this more energetic population is. So if we calculate the oxygen moments and just include the energetic portion and then plot the velocities, you see that they actually lie exactly on top of each other. That what you see here, even when we're going to the magnetosheath, is a population that's flowing at the same velocity, but just from looking at the energy spectrum, you wouldn't actually get that impression. So these are just all things to sort of keep in mind when you're looking at the oxygen. Okay, so the first impact that I wanted to talk about is the impact on loading and unloading. So if we look at the sort of standard picture of a substorm, during the growth phase, you have magnetic flux accumulated in the lobe, and that leads to an increase in the flaring angle, and so more of the pressure from the solar wind is transmitted into the tail, and so you have a pressure increase in the tail during the growth phase. And then at the expansion phase, an instability develops, a near-Earth reconnection line forms, and that excess magnetic flux is reconnected, and so that plasma pressure decreases. And so that maximum pressure is a measure of the stability in the sense that it's a measure of how much flux can be accumulated before the reconnection is triggered. And the pressure decrease rate is a measure of how fast the magnetic flux is reconnecting. But we need to normalize out variations in the solar wind dynamic pressure in order to look at that effect. And this shows how that's done. Here's a simple magnetopause with the solar wind impinging on it. So pressure balance at the magnetopause is given here by the solar wind. This is the solar wind dynamic pressure, the solar wind thermal pressure. So that impinging on the magnetopause is then equal to the total pressure that's observed in the plasma sheet. That's just pressure balance in this direction. The thermal term tends to be small, and so we can drop that and then solve for this flaring angle, and that gives you a parameter then that in this model is just changing with the loading and unloading. The additional complication is that the magnetopause isn't just a line like this, it has a shape, and so you also have to correct a little bit for the distance down the tail, and we do that using the magnetopause model of Petrinic and Russell. So we end up with a parameter, this sine squared alpha prime, which just varies with the loading and unloading of the magnetosphere. So here, this is a sample event. You can identify the substorm onset here. So you can see the sort of the classic pressure increase during the growth phase and then the decrease during the expansion phase. And then this is our normalized flaring angle parameter that again shows the increase and decrease. So we can measure this for a range of events and record the proton and oxygen densities for each of our events when we're in the plasma sheet. And so the results are shown here. So this is showing the maximum, this normalized flaring angle, the maximum angle that we reach, and then the angle decrease rate as a function of, this is a function of proton density, a function of oxygen density, oxygen to proton ratio, and mass density. And what you see, first of all, is that there's no correlation with proton density, and that's good because that means we've taken out the dependence just on solar wind pressure. But we do still see a positive correlation both in the maximum angle and in the angle decrease rate with oxygen density and oxygen density ratio, with both of them being higher when there's more oxygen in the tail. So that indicates that the tail is more stable when there's more oxygen, so it allows greater loading to occur, and that the rate that the lobe flux reconnections is actually faster when there's more oxygen. So that could be due either to a faster reconnection rate or to reconnection occurring over a wider area of the tail, because it's sort of a global measure of the decrease rate. Okay, so those are interesting results, and so we're now trying to look more into the microphysics of how the oxygen is behaving in the tail. So we've been looking, for example, at how the oxygen affects the reconnection current sheet thickness. Now the thickness of the current sheet thickness depends on the ion inertial length or the ion gyroradius. And if you read the papers, you find people say both things, and these two in the plasma sheet tend to be of about the same order, and so it's hard for in a particular case to say whether it's really scaling as the ion inertial length or as the ion gyroradius. Both of these parameters scale with the square root of the mass, so no matter what, if you have an oxygen-dominated plasma sheet, it should be thicker, but one scales as the density and the other as the magnetic field, so they're not the same. So we wanted to look at then the thickness of the current sheet and for a number of events and see if we can figure out that scaling. So we started with a number of magnetotail reconnection events that had been identified by Eastwood et al. And from those events, we determined the current sheet thickness using a number of different methods, and depending on the situation, the spacing of the satellites, some methods are more effective in some situations than others. But we use, for example, a two spacecraft data to do a fit to a 1D Harris current sheet, and we have there are 3 cluster spacecraft that have the data that we need, and so we can do three different pairs from this to get 3 independent methods. We use a method developed by Liu et al. Called the time-varying Harris current sheet, where you first get the current using a 4 spacecraft kilometer technique, and then again fit to the different spacecraft. And then a third method called the magnetic field gradient method, developed by Shen et al., that again uses the kilometer technique to get the gradient of B and then determining the current thickness from that. So this is an example, again, taking these reconnection events identified by Eastwood et al. We first went through the events, made sure we had the signatures of the X line. So here you see the flow reversal. So these are three spacecraft measurements, and you can see the flow reversal in all 3 spacecraft. You see the change in BZ, and BZ also at all 3 spacecraft. You can see here that when we go through the X line, the 3 spacecraft are straddling the neutral sheet. And so now, then our current sheet determination is in this bottom panel with all these different methods. In this particular case, the gradient B method is sort of an outlier, but the rest all fall down here. And then for each of these time periods, we get the temperatures and densities and so on in order to look for the scaling. So this is the results. So this is the current sheet thickness. And here we're showing it as a function of the gyro radius using the local magnetic field. This is as a function of the gyro radius using the lobe magnetic field, and this is as a function of the ion inertial length. And the top row is using the proton parameters to define these, and here we're using the oxygen parameters. And what we find is that basically the current sheet thickness is equal to proton gyro radius. So the slope, I know you can't read it up here, but actually the slope is 1. The current sheet thickness is equal to the proton gyro radius. You could also say that it scales with the oxygen gyro radius, but of course those two things scale with each other, and this is the one with the slope of 1, and it's not scaling with the inertial length as measured locally. So the different data points are colored by the amount of oxygen. So the open circles are low oxygen events, the closed are higher oxygen events, and this one red point was we really had oxygen dominant, and it doesn't seem to make any difference. They all basically lie on this line that's determined by the proton gyro radius. So that's again an indication that that's probably due to the larger gyro radius of the oxygen means that it's really not playing so much a role in defining the current sheet thickness. Okay, so then I wanted to talk about a larger scale impact of oxygen, and that is the impact it may have on generating sawtooth events. So sawtooth events are also substorms, but they're substorms that occur periodically. They tend to occur with a period of about 3 hours, and they're standardly identified by the signature at geosynchronous orbit in the energetic protons, where you see a very sharp increase and then a decrease. So it has this sawtooth-like signature. Compared to isolated substorms, they tend to have a stronger response and to be more extended in magnetic local time. So they seem to be sort of a bigger substorm, and they most often occur during storm times. So Bill Lotko and his group at Dartmouth have done a lot of simulation work to see if these sawtooth oscillations may be driven by oxygen outflow. And their simulations have shown that the oxygen outflow can drive the onset of sawtooth events, with the period driven by the outflow rate. And this just shows simulations using a number of different drivers and showing the different periods that you get in the sawtooth depending on the outflow. And the basic model is that the increased input from the solar wind is driving the outflow. The outflow fills the plasma sheet. The pressure from that ends up distending the magnetic field. A substorm occurs, and that drives more outflow, and that process repeats. more recent work, they've been looking at the difference between a CME-type driver and SIRs, and they think that this oxygen-driven case may be more important in the CME, for the CME-driven storms. So we wanted to look at this from an observational point of view to see if there was evidence of oxygen being the driver. So this is a case study. So again, this is the Los Alamos energetic particle data. This is a two-tooth sawtooth event that is occurring during a storm and is driven by this strong southward BZ. And this is the plasma sheet data from Cluster. The top panel shows the plasma beta. So that's how we identify when we're in the plasma sheet. And that's what the red bars mark the plasma sheet time periods. And then these dashed lines are showing when the sawtooth occurs. You can see that the second sawtooth really looks like the classic substorm this is the total pressure. So you see, again, the total pressure increase during the growth phase and then the decrease during the expansion phase. The first one is a little bit less classic. But what we find is that the oxygen to proton ratio is low prior to the first sawtooth, but then in fact we do see the oxygen increasing and prior to the second onset, which is what the Bramble's model would suggest. Then the onset occurs and the oxygen is still high, and in this case we're not triggering an additional one after it. So there's some hint here that this simulation may be correct. So we then tried looking at a superposed epoch analysis. So we started by just identifying all the isolated substorms and all the sawtooth event teeth, and plotted so each tooth of the substorm and each isolated substorm with a superposed epoch time. That's the onset of the substorm or the onset of the sawtooth tooth. And what you see is that in fact the sawtooth events do on average have significantly higher oxygen, and that you see this oxygen increase during the growth phase of the sawtooth events. And while as during isolated substorms, there's really no clear change. But the problem is that, as I said, sawtooth events tend to occur during storms. Isolated substorms can occur at any time, some during storms and some during not. But if you take an average of them, they're definitely dominated by non-storm times. And there's definitely a strong correlation between high oxygen and storm times. So it's not clear whether this is actually a storm effect that we're looking at or whether it's a sawtooth event. And so to determine that, we then divided our data by storm phase. So this shows the non-storm data, substorms and sawtooth events. These are the ones that occur during storm main phase, and this is during storm recovery phase. Now the gray bars on these show just what the average composition is when there aren't any events, and you can clearly see that from non-storm to storm times, there's no matter what, it is significantly higher oxygen. There was only one sawtooth event that occurred during non-storm time. It is associated with higher than average oxygen. But during the storm main phase, which is when really most of the sawtooth events happen, it's maybe a little bit higher, but it's really not significantly different either from the average substorms or even from the composition when there's not an event. During recovery phase, actually, there's significantly higher oxygen than during the isolated substorms. And then another way to look at this is to see what the probability is of observing a substorm or a sawtooth event as a function of the oxygen to proton ratio. So during non-storm times, if you look at this scale, it's only going up to 10% here. So most of the time, you don't have an event, and maybe up to 2% of the time you see a substorm, and only very rare do you get a sawtooth event. In the storm main phase, now this is going up to 100% here, up to 1. So this is the profile for substorms as a function of of composition, and this is the Sawtooth events. So you do tend to get the Sawtooth events for higher oxygen to proton ratio, but you certainly can get them over a range. And it actually, at the highest, the most likely thing with the highest ratio is that we get is that you don't have either a sawtooth or a substorm. So that's sort of odd. And then again, in substorm recovery phase, the higher oxygen does tend to be associated with sawtooth. So definitely the picture is not nearly as clear as that Bramble simulation might suggest. Sawtooth events do tend to be associated with high oxygen to proton ratio, and so they may play some role, but it's certainly not necessary to have high oxygen in order to get an event, and there's many high oxygen time periods that do not have sawtooth events. So there's clearly other factors that are more important than oxygen in triggering this mode. Okay. All right, so to summarize, so we're looking for these impacts of heavy ions. We find that actually they're fairly subtle. We keep looking for the smoking gun that shows a really strong dynamic impact, and we haven't really found the strong one. But there's a number of effects that are interesting to look at. So the storm loading and unloading, we do find that the high oxygen is associated with greater loading and faster unloading. And so I think we really need sort of kinetic simulations to look at that, and particularly how the oxygen affects the reconnection rate to see if we can understand that effect. We've looked at the reconnecting current sheet thickness, and we find that the oxygen is not having a big impact on that thickness, even when the oxygen content is relatively high. And then for sawtooth events, the role of oxygen seems to be somewhat more complex than suggested by the Brambles et al. Simulations. And while oxygen is playing a role, it doesn't seem like it's the dominant driver of the sawtooth events.
Okay, thank you. We have time for time for a couple of comments or some questions. Mark? There you go.
Thank you. Has anybody come up with a theory of why the oxygen content does not affect the reconnecting plasma sheet?
The reconnecting current sheet?
Current sheet.
The current sheet thickness. I mean, I think that it's just the larger, more like a single particle moving through the plasma sheet. That the current sheet is probably being defined by the electrons and the protons, and the oxygen is just kind of, it's the larger gyro radius. It's not really magnetized going through. That's my guess.
Anybody else? Didn't see any hands. Come on. I asked you to stop too soon.
I can keep going.
So, and you say two different things about the effect of O+ on reconnection. One is that it could potentially lower reconnection because of reducing the alphane speed. But another point, it's possible to increase the reconnection rate.
That's right.
So.
Right. So the slow reconnection rate is as it goes as the alphane speed, and that's kind of the fluid picture. I guess the big point I would say is that you can't really just consider oxygen to be another fluid. It's really the kinetic effects that are important, because its scale size is larger compared to the current sheet thickness.
I would also say, even in the fluid case, just saying you lower the alphane speed reduces the reconnection rate may not be exactly correct, because you can also adjust the other parameters around the reconnection area that could change it in ways that aren't related to just the alphane speed.
Yeah. And certainly I don't have answers to why these things are true, and I'm hoping to sort of spur more investigation.
Anybody else?
Lynn, question on dayside reconnection. Are there cluster observations of oxygen ions at the dayside merging region?
Oh, yes. Yeah, we're doing studies on that as well.
Significant amounts?
Significant amounts of oxygen?
Yes.
Yeah, occasionally there are significant amounts. I mean, the drift paths bring the energetic oxygen around to the dayside in similar places to where the plume also hits it. The plume has a higher density, but the energetic oxygen can have a higher oxygen content.
Can
and
you
so,
define energetic in this case at, in the merging
like
region?
10 keV or
Thank you.
so, yeah.